Good morning and welcome to this national consultation on social justice for children and to end child abuse and violence against children. I'm Gertrud Lenzer. It is my privilege now to introduce to you the president of Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, Dr. Karen Gould.
Thank you, Gertrude. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, good morning. I want to welcome you to today's consultation. Thank you for giving of your time and attention and expertise to consider how we might bring an end to child abuse and violence against children. It is truly important work. 3 weeks ago, the BBC reported that 20,000 American children are believed to have been killed in their homes by family members over the past 10 years. This is nearly 4 times the number of US soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan during the same period. The United States has the worst record among developed countries for deaths related to child abuse and neglect. The rate is 3 times that of Canada and 11 times that of Italy. Clearly, it is a problem that needs to be addressed. That's where all of you come in. The breadth of experience assembled here for today's consultation is truly impressive. We have leading policymakers, scholars, jurists, researchers, advocates, and others invested in the welfare of our children and of generations to come. Nowhere is there a group of people more prepared to envision and enact workable solutions to the epidemic of child abuse in the United States. Thank you, therefore, for all of your support of this dialogue and for your participation. We are sincerely grateful. I also wish to express our appreciation to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for funding today's program, as well as the New York Community Trust and the Oak Foundation for additional support. Without generous contributions from these funders, we would not have been able to convene here today to discuss this very important topic. Last but not least, I want to acknowledge the tremendous work of Professor Gertrud Lenzer, Director of the Children's Studies Center and founder of the field of the sociology of children. 20 years ago, due to Professor Lenzer's extraordinary vision, Brooklyn College established the nation's first children and youth studies program, along with the Children's Studies Center for Research, Policy, and Public Service. Those of you who know her know that Dr. Lenzer has a deep passion for her work, the vision to imagine a better future for all children, and the tenacity to get things done. I hope today's conversations are productive as well as enjoyable, and that the outcomes of this critical dialogue will help to inspire real and ongoing change. Thank you again for participating, and now I would like to introduce my CUNY colleague, Michelle Anderson, Dean of the CUNY Law School. Michelle?
Hello, everyone. I want to also extend my welcoming remarks to everyone for coming and attending and participating in this very important national consultation on social justice for children to end abuse and violence against children. I'm really pleased to be here, particularly with so many luminaries in the field who can really help us understand the problem and try to solve it together. I also, like Karen, want to really thank Gertrud Lenzer and others at the Children's Studies Center for Research, Policy, and Public Service at Brooklyn College. I think what they've done here in assembling this consultation is extraordinary. So I just want to give a round of applause to Gertrud. I am Dean of the CUNY School of Law, and our school has a close affinity with the work of the Children's Studies Center and with family law in general. We're actually one of the very few law schools in the country to require all students to take family law. They take it in their first semester of law school. We feel like it's crucially important for public interest attorneys to understand family law and to be a part of it, part of making it better. A retired judge of the New York Family Court, Judge Brian Hamill, who is a CUNY Law alum, also teaches an advanced seminar on family law at CUNY. Judge Hamill, by the way, has been pulled out of retirement to preside over a model court serving youth transitioning out of foster care, a crucial issue. And lastly, we also offer a family law concentration for our students in the third year, and that's the faculty member involved in that is Professor Angela Burton, who will be with us today. Before becoming dean at CUNY Law, I taught a course on children in the law for 8 years as a professor of law. And in that course, we begin on day one with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, this aspirational document. So I'm very interested to hear all of the speakers today, particularly our first one. And when I first started teaching this area, it was, it's a very painful area to study. It's a very important area to study, and what I was struck with is that you can't really study this area in any depth without coming to terms with so many things, like the real emotional devastation of physical and sexual abuse, as well as the neglect of children. And we're talking about long-term harm. It was striking to me and to many people in this room, I'm sure, the intergenerational nature of this harm. And also, it seems to me that no one can study this area without having to grapple with what is sometimes the profound and painful conflict between the constitutional rights of the parents and the rights of the child as well. Particularly when we speak about violence against children. It's striking also the imperfection of the state when it chooses to intervene in the lives of children and remove children from the home. And it's striking the harm. It's striking to really deliberate on the question of harm that visits upon children who are removed from the home, sometimes even worse harm than remaining in a neglectful or an abusive home. It really struck me that the state is an inadequate parent, and we need to figure out how to think about this problem. One testament to the inadequacy of the parent, of the state functioning as a parent, is really the intergenerational nature of foster care itself. The consultation today will address these extremely complex, seemingly intractable problems and has 4 central goals. First, to draw attention to the epidemic levels of violence against children in the United States. Second, to deliberate on the latest findings from neuroscience and from social science to try to shed light on our understanding of these problems. Third, to bring together people leaders in the research community, the judiciary, the Department of Justice, child protective and child advocacy agencies, and the New York state legislators, with the goal of really promoting closer collaboration to remedy the problem of violence against children. And the last goal is to promote new federal, state, and local policies and legislative measures to address violence against children. I'm very excited to be a part of these proceedings and to see them result in actual deeper reflection on these issues and as well as possible solutions. So please enjoy this conference today.
Thank you, President Gould, and thank you, Dean Anderson, for your welcoming remarks and really to open this consultation in a most fitting and wonderful way. Distinguished speakers, participants, colleagues and guests assembled here today at the National Consultation to promote social justice for children and to end child abuse and violence against children in our nation. It was in 1909 that under President Theodore Roosevelt, the first White House Conference on Care of Dependent Children was convened to improve the conditions of dependent and neglected children. 6 more White House conferences on children and youth followed in 1919, in 1929, in 1939, in 1950, 1960, and 1970. All of these White House conferences were dedicated to improving child welfare and the position of children in the United States. After these conferences, President Ronald Reagan and Congress created the National Commission on Children in 1987 to explore and promote a new national agenda toward improving the conditions of children in our nation. Their reports and the major concerns and recommendations expressed in them sound strangely familiar to the concerns we have today in 2011. The question then arises, why is it that we have to revisit these preoccupations and, as it were, rediscover the importance of children and the lack of national attention to them? What needs to be done today to bring about effective and lasting changes in the conditions of children and the epidemic levels of violence experienced by them? After more than 100 years of commitment and periodic recommitment to children in the United States, we meet here today to draw concerted attention to the reality of child maltreatment and violence against children as a national condition of epidemic proportions. We will hear today from distinguished Professor Silver, McEwen, Champagne, and Dr. Mercy about the compelling findings from neuroscience and epigenetic research about children exposed to stress, maltreatment, and lack of maternal care, as well as the public health problems and economic costs to the nation engendered by all those children exposed to epidemic levels of violence. Professor Finkelhor will discuss the social science findings of his first national survey of children exposed to violence, published in 2009, and Professor Strauss will address, and I quote, "Spanking by Parents and its lifelong damage to children, families, and society," unquote. Our nationally distinguished judges, the Honorable Judith Kay and the Honorable Patricia Martin, will discuss new paths for juvenile and family court systems. Dr. Fiona Wyrick will report to us on the Defending Childhood initiative undertaken by U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. In the afternoon, our distinguished panel members from the Child Protection and Child Advocacy agencies will discuss maltreatment of children indicated by the high incidence of child poverty, child trafficking, and sexual exploitation of children, along with the pervasive underreporting of child abuse in the United States and the need for changes in our juvenile justice systems, as well as initiatives undertaken by the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office to combat violence against children. We will also hear from members of the New York State Legislative Branch about the initiatives they plan to put in place to combat child abuse and violence against children in our state. At the opening of our consultation this morning, we have the privilege of hearing from Marta Santos Pais, Esquire, the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General on Violence Against Children, and the initiatives she has taken internationally to protect children from violence. In brief, then, the task before us today is to explore how we can address together the epidemic realities of violence against children without winding up once again with recommendations which are doomed to remain as no more than rhetoric. May I conclude my introductory remarks with the hope that this multidisciplinary and cross-sectoral consultation will lead to continued collaboration and efforts in future in the service of the 74 million children in the United States who can neither represent themselves nor have a vote or voice in order to promote their own well-being, their protection from harm, and the realization of their human rights. It is now my distinct privilege to introduce to you Marta Santos Pais, a long-time colleague and may I hope friend. And we are we're very pleased that indeed that she can come and take time from all her missions around the globe. She has, in my view, in the last 2 years since she has become the special representative, produced miracles. She has gotten the Council of Europe and the European Union and governments in Latin America, in Africa and in Asia to develop policies, to develop legislation, to develop plans of national plans of action. And so it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As you will understand, the magic that is portrayed of me does not really correspond to reality, but it shows the friendship with Gertrud. And of course, you make the miracles, and I'm so honored to be here today. I want to thank the Brooklyn College for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to listen and to be inspired by the great work that you are all promoting. I travel a lot around the world, but it's not often that we have discussions within the United States, and it's so important to feel excited by so many important things that are happening, but also to feel humble when we think about the many others that are missing here and in other parts of the world. So it's a great, great pleasure to be here and together with you dream about the way, as Gertrud has just said, to move from rhetoric to tangible action that makes a difference for children around the world. I want to start by acknowledging the many important, significant developments that have taken place in the recent past within the United States, and I think they are incredibly encouraging. I believe they show that this is a concern for the current administration, and a very steady attention is being given to this topic. The Comprehensive National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, of which I'm sure we will hear much more in a moment, the launch by the Attorney General of the Initiative Defending Childhood, and the establishment less than a month ago of a national task force to develop knowledge and spread awareness about the phenomenon of violence against children are very concrete illustrations of this important trend. And I believe that these initiatives open incredible opportunities for us all to feel more confident that violence prevention is feasible and that we can more effectively protect children who are victims or who are witnesses of violence. And we can, of course, with all these initiatives, be hopeful that there will be greater evidence informing decisions, decisions by policymakers, by lawmakers, by those who decide budgets, and in this country this is so important, and also those who think about the budget for development cooperation to support initiatives in other parts of the world. But of course, when I think about the magnitude of the phenomenon of violence against children in the United States and the results of the National Comprehensive Survey, which very briefly acknowledges that more than 60% of the children that were interviewed, in fact, were exposed to violence, which may be neglect, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, we feel absolutely daunting. The task ahead is dramatic. And of course, the news that we heard at the very start of this important conference, launched by the BBC, which are based on another piece of research conducted in the United States, that every 5 hours there is a child who dies as a result of neglect and abuse in this country, is something that we cannot believe. It's so beyond imagination. And I think you will recall, of course, this video that is now taking so much attention in this country about a judge in Texas who was whipping his child. And I'm sure it is just one very tangible example of what happens within the privacy of the family. But at the same time, it should not take away the hope and our belief that families can play the most decisive role in helping to prevent violence and helping to empower children to be the first line of defense when any risk of violence confronts their lives. But of course, as you may guess, these indications in the United States are not limited to the country and are not limited to North America. And I would like to tell you a little bit about the global picture around the world, because violence is in fact a global phenomenon, and it doesn't know any geographic border, any cultural border, any economic or political limitation. It touches on each and every part of the world. What I find is very dramatic is that in spite of the fact that it has such a high magnitude, even if we only know the tip of the iceberg, it's still very hidden. It's still perceived as a social taboo. It is widely concealed by professionals, by family members, by children themselves who feel completely frightened to speak up. We believe from available research that every year from 500 million to 1.5 billion children suffer some form of violence. Again, violence in many forms, violence in many settings, in the home, in schools, in communities, in institutions, including in justice institutions. And very often what is dramatic is this context. Some of these institutions are expected to be the best protective environment for the children, where violence in the end continues to happen. As you know, violence happens when children witness violent incidents in the street, in the home, in the school, but also when they are targeted by violent acts, which may be in the form of intimidation, of humiliation, threatening that the child will be abandoned if the child doesn't behave. It may be physical aggression, it may be spanking, it may be sexual violence and abuse. In some countries, as you know, children are sold for adoption, sometimes disguised in other ways. In other places, they are forced to get married at a very early stage in their lives. They are forced into labor, where violence is part of the picture. I mean, domestic service is just one important example. And in many countries, children still continue to be at risk of being sentenced to stoning, to amputation, to capital punishment, to life imprisonment. And unfortunately, in some of these areas, the figures we know of are just growing. So perhaps it's greater awareness, but it's not a very positive and encouraging indication. UNICEF, and I'm very pleased that Susan Bissell, leading this area in the organization, is here today. UNICEF conducted a groundbreaking study on child disciplinary practices by parents within the home a few months ago. The study was launched, and you can find it on the website of UNICEF. It covers 35 developing countries, and it was the first time that information about countries in the South was in fact pulled together. And what it says, very briefly, is that 75% of children between 2 and 14 years of age are, exposed to different forms of violence within the home. It may be shouting, it may be yelling or screaming at the child, but it also may be much more severe forms of violence, spanking, hitting, beating the child, and very often also the most serious forms, using an object, a belt or a whip or a stick or a hairbrush, or whatever is at hand. This is of course traumatic, but I want to also acknowledge that one of the findings of the study that gives me great hope is the fact that when asked, the large majority of parents recognized that they didn't feel that violence was needed as a child-rearing practice. At the same time, they acknowledged that they didn't know what other alternatives existed for them to help their children behave and be responsible citizens. So we have an opportunity to invest in good parenting and all the prevention, I'm sure, initiatives we will hear during the day. Of course, outside of the home, violence is not less present, and in schools it is very, very present, and we see this in a number of surveys conducted around the world. In some countries, the level of child abuse is so high that kids have now found a new vocabulary. They tell you that the question is sex for grades. Either you are in agreement with the sexual favors that are asked from you, or you will not progress in your education system. And it's so difficult, isn't it, to come forward and to complain about the teacher or the staff in the school. What is dramatic is that in many countries around the world, the use of violence as a disciplinary measure within the schools is not even prohibited by law. 80 countries still admit it, and sometimes it is caning and whipping that is foreseen as the natural way of disciplining children. And when you look at the legislation of these countries, the detail with which the guidance is provided either to the headmaster or to the professor or the teacher to comply with the requirements of the law are just surprising. Let me say surprising. Of course, traditional practices are also very widespread around the world, as you know. Female genital mutilation and early marriage are just two that I will mention as an example, although, to be honest, in my job I'm learning more and more about dramatic other forms of violence affecting children. And what I find is very dramatic is that when we are dealing with these very deeply rooted conventions in society, it is of course not enough to have the law saying it is prohibited or the public policy enacted by the government anticipating some measures if we do not work with the communities where the practice is maintained. And if the change does not come from within, it will not last, as we have learned, unfortunately. But what we see is that girls from the poorest households around the world are 3 times more likely to be forced to get married at an early age. And as you may have seen in a number of studies conducted by UNICEF, in a number of countries, pregnant girls or married girls are forced to leave the school system, very often without an opportunity to go back. If girls give birth to a child before 15 years of age, they are 5 times more at risk of dying giving birth than a woman that is mother around 20 years of age. So the dramatic incidence of all these forms is, of course, very telling. Very often we tend to speak about girls, and of course we forget that boys are equally targeted by many forms of violence, including sexual abuse and exploitation. And although when we talk to boys, they acknowledge that socially it's very difficult to come forward because there is all this pressure that boys are strong and they will resist and this will not happen to them. In some countries where surveys have been conducted, in fact, data confirms that boys are more affected by sexual abuse than girls. I'm just coming from Zanzibar where this is confirmed, and it is just one example. South Asia would give many other examples. Now, of course, when we talk about violence, and for you who are very knowledgeable experts, this is not news, but we think about the moment where the violent act happens. But of course, what is dramatic is that it stays forever, very often for a whole life of a child. And the responses to address this are not very often in place. So children are hampered in their ability to develop, to have social relationships that are based on trust and confidence with other people. They are limited in their learning abilities, in their school performance. Very often they end up having very difficult mental problems that are very frequently not addressed. But of course, in addition to the impact on the child who suffers violence, what is dramatic is that the friends of the child, the peers of the child, those who surround the child suffer equally. And I'm struck by the number of countries that I visited where the level of dropouts in school is in fact growing because parents are afraid of sending very often their girls to school when there is a very high level of sexual abuse happening in the school or on the way to school or from school. So we see that this has in fact a very important implication also for social policies that are necessary, including to ensure the fundamental right to education to all children with quality and in a safe context. Of course, I always like to remind myself that responding to violence is very important, but it is much more costly than investing in prevention. And in this regard, you may have seen, but perhaps less than a year ago, the European Union conducted a very interesting study about how much is spent in the 27 member states to respond to domestic violence. And it's at least 16 billion euro per year. But when the study went further to understand what would be the return if a euro is invested in prevention, it's only 87 euro per euro invested in prevention. And I keep telling myself, my Lord, in a moment where we are so dramatically worried about the impact of the financial and economic crisis, I mean, not to forget the European countries and my own country, Portugal, where this is so present, the truth is that most countries feel that the best is to cut on social spending. The best is to start with children because they will have no vote, they will have no voice, and families can survive, something will work out. But we know that this will have a very dramatic impact, of course, on the life of children. So this is, in a nutshell, what I see in my work. But again, the fact that this is a phenomenon that is very emotional, that is very sensitive, that is perceived as a taboo, that people tend to hide, makes it very difficult to come forward, to have reports, to have data, and the statistical information we have around the world is very limited. That's why the Comprehensive National Survey of the US is so important, as a very important example in this regard. And, professionals very often feel tempted not to do anything about it because they lack guidance, they lack standards, they lack codes of conduct. They have no binding requirement to report in many countries. And it's so much easier, to say, this is not my business, someone will do something about it. And the parents sometimes feel very much afraid that by telling the story of what has happened to their kids, admitting it did not happen in the home, which is the largest cases, they feel that perhaps the child is going to be stigmatized further, and that is a risk, so very often they don't speak up. And the children feel pressed to conceal these cases, because it's so difficult to say. And what they tell me over and over again is that when they find the courage to speak up, they are not trusted, they are judged, and nothing happens as a result. So they keep saying, can we find impunity? What is the way of doing that? I'm saying this because you will, I'm sure, come forward with many good suggestions for us to share with many other people in the world. So, in view of this reality, what I have tried to do is, of course, base myself on a very important study to which several of you have contributed, the UN study on violence against children that was endorsed by the General Assembly in 2006, and it has a very good set of recommendations, and I'm emphasizing 3 important recommendations. The first one is that each country should have, each state should have, each municipality should have a very clear vision and a very clear strategy to address violence against children. The second one is that it is important that we have strong legislation that gives a very unquestionable message of the unacceptable, existence of violence in any form, in the family, in the school, in institutions, everywhere and at all times. And the third is that we need more data and better research to influence action and to break the invisibility and the silence around violence. Of course, in many countries there are pieces of this, but we don't have enough. And I am very excited by the fact that you will be devoting attention to the discussion of a New York State Commission on Child Abuse and Violence Against Children. And I would encourage you to address it and to go forward. It's so important, the experts and decision makers that are present in this conference, if we think about how they can be widened by so many actors that can make a difference, who can think together and see the child not divided across disciplines and sectors, but a multidimensional human being that can be helped to prevent violence and also to respond to violence. It's a unique opportunity to move forward. With resources attached, of course, because without resources we don't go far, and with a good evaluation system. On the legislation, I wanted also to say that, today we have more than 30 countries around the world with a very clear piece of legislation saying, sometimes in the Constitution, that it is forbidden to ill-treat children in whatever way, in whatever form or place. But it's only 5% of the children of the world, which is basically nothing. And in many cases, there is, of course, legislation to prohibit specific forms of violence, but again, if they are not pulled together, it is very difficult to move forward. On the question of data and research, I was just recently in Tanzania, where a groundbreaking study was done, and I'm very happy that some of the actors behind the study are also present here. And I feel so encouraged by this initiative because the survey that was conducted with young people from 13 to 24 years of age was led by the government, a multi-sector task force of the government in which civil society organizations also participated. And when the findings were presented internally, the magnitude of and the incidence of violence was so high that the government felt that it would not be possible to release the information without having a very clear response of what the government would be doing to address it. And I find incredibly encouraging to see that each and every member of government stood at the moment of the launch of the study to acknowledge the dramatic dimension of the reality they were dealing with, and at the same time what each department would be doing, in which way, and across the country. There is a great opportunity to make it move, and I hope that this will remain a very good example for many parts of the world. So what I'm telling basically is that violence is not inevitable. It can be prevented, it can be addressed, and in fact we can celebrate many more developments rather than regret the many cases that we hear every day and every moment. If we have a good vision and strategy, if we have a strong legislation, if we have the evidence that is required to influence the best decisions, we can move forward. And of course, I recognize that the family remains at the center of the solutions, and we need to invest in supporting families in their child rearing responsibilities. Good parenting initiatives, visitation programs, starting early, even before we don't dream of forming a family. That's so important to make things work. And basic social services to families who are more vulnerable and at risk, of course, is part of the answer. The role of the government is very important in this area, all parts of government, and of course in the United States, all states have a very important role in this regard. But of course, national institutions, lawmakers and independent institutions, civil society, private sector, the media, so many actors play a very important role. And of course, because the United States is such an important donor country, it's such an important country that supports others around the world, I think it's very important that those who take decisions in that regard can also be assuming this important role. I didn't speak about children because there is not time, and I'm sure you will, but of course children need to be part of this process. They are part of the solution. They have the best perception of what violence means to their lives and the best indication of the solutions that can work for people like them. And I think we cannot afford not to do research with them, we cannot afford not to find solutions to address it. So I would like to encourage you to be not only good dreamers, but ambitious in your deliberations, because we need to transform violence against children from a concern of a few, and I'm sure that all of us here, into a priority for everyone in the United States and beyond. So thank you again for the honor of being today with you.
Thank you very much. We'll just have a brief break, but since Marta Santos Pais mentioned it, you will have in your folder a joint statement which we hope you will consider and sign and come out in support. And one of the recommendations of this joint statement is to establish a New York State Commission on Child Abuse and Violence Against Children. And we have the very good fortune that one of the legislators of this afternoon's panel actually has already indicated that he will introduce legislation to create the commission, New York State Commission on Child Abuse and Violence Against Children. So, but since it was mentioned already, I thought I should, but also draw your attention to the joint statement, which by now already has been signed by many people and organizations, but more about it later. Thank you very much, and I'll introduce now Professor Silver, who will be the chair and moderate the next panel.